Hello, Stephen.
Hi, good morning, David.
Good morning. We're doing our first blogging cast together. We're talking about your article in Foreign Affairs and some other recent Middle Eastern political developments. We've exchanged words together often, but we've never had a chance to talk not face-to-face, but voice-to-voice. So I'm pleased to make your acquaintance in this more human way.
Likewise, I'm looking forward to the conversation. We've got some interesting topics lined up. There's the Foreign Affairs article. We'll talk a little about Lebanon, and then touch on the controversy surrounding the president's 60th Israeli independence anniversary Knesset speech, in which he deplored what he characterized as appeasement on the part of some people who endorse talks, I guess, with Hamas and Hezbollah. It wasn't really clear. But
so why don't you begin by summarize your article for those who aren't familiar with it.
All right. The article really was intended to make one big point. And that big point is that the way in which the surge has been discussed is not entirely off base. The discussion has focused on the fact that over the past, 9 months or so, casualties in Iraq have come down quite a bit, and that this lessening of casualties coincided with the surge, preceded the surge by a bit, and it's taken place in some provinces where the surge forces weren't deployed, but nevertheless, during the period of the surge, there was a lessening of casualties, which is a very good thing, a really good thing. But I point to a problem with the surge that I fear officials haven't been focusing on quite enough, and it's this. By arming and equipping and funding an extraordinarily large Sunni army outside of the framework of the Iraqi state. In other words, these soldiers are not being paid by the Iraqi state, they're not under Iraqi command, and they haven't really been folded into broader Iraqi society at all. By doing these things, the United States is saddling Iraq with a problem that will really mature in the coming years. And that's the problem of a tribally based Sunni force, very large, not folded into the state, and in many ways opposed to it. And that this significant force is going to present a problem for Iraq as it tries to come together in the coming years into a unitary and cohesive state. So in the article, I really just endorse getting back to what they used to call the top-down approach, which was the effort to integrate Sunnis into Iraq instead of separating them from the state. That's it in a nutshell, David.
All right. Well, the article appeared, in early April.
It's towards the end of April, early May, I guess.
So it would have been written before the operations in Basra.
It was written before the Basra, operations.
Where, again, the news seems to be pretty good.
Well, I interpret the news a little bit differently. Maybe I'm just a congenital pessimist. In fact, I probably am. But, there were some negative trends evident down there. And, from my point of view, I don't see the really good outcome. Mostly because I saw Muqtada Sadr, doing what he has done in the past, which is pose a challenge to the state or to the U.S., make it a very dramatic challenge, and then when there's pushback, simply melt away within the framework of a negotiated agreement that allows him to play the field
the Iraqi army
another day.
The Iraqi army is now the dominant presence in Basra. There are reports in places like the International Herald Tribune of a decline in gangsterism, of religious vigilante groups, and markets open longer. And there seems to be new oil field activity, new bids on oil fields, oil flows being less intercepted by criminal gangs. That's all good news. And now we have a new operation in Mosul, where again the news seems to be pretty good.
I've been reading the reports, I guess, a little bit differently. First, as far as the situation down south is concerned, both in Basra but also in Sadr City, where there have been some major operations, my reading is that Iraqi troops didn't perform that well and, in fact, had to be bailed out by American forces and, to some extent, British forces. And I would expect, at this point, given Sadr's kind of melt-away tactic to fight again another day, that things would be calm for the moment. But I don't expect the Iraqi army presence to last very long or to be very effective. In Mosul, there have been some serious setbacks to the Iraqi army up there, and unfortunately, the forces that they were trying to fight, the Al-Qaeda terrorists, have themselves melted away and gone elsewhere.
Or
very good at that.
Been defeated and destroyed. I mean, according that the websites we have that report on what the terrorists themselves say, the Al-Qaeda terrorists, they seem to be in a kind of state of despair, and that they are reporting a collapse of their ability to launch operations. I mean, here's I guess what was my reaction to the article as I read it. The article does a reasonably fair job of laying out the good news and of the destruction of Al-Qaeda in Anbar province. And when we say decline in casualties, it's not just military casualties, but the dramatic decline in Iraqi civilian casualties. And you say, well, all of this is insufficient. Now, here was my question. One of the things that critics of the Bush administration said in 2004 and 2005 and 2006 is the Bush administration is focused on all these grandiose political objectives. They don't realize that security must come first. In 2007, the president never quite ever says you are right to his critics, but he reverses himself and he does what the critics were urging on him to do. He adopts a security-first strategy. And that strategy has turned out to be quite successful, and it's now opened the way for the beginnings of something that does look like a kind of political reconciliation between the Sunni sheikhs of Anbar province and the central government, some openings toward a kind of workable federalism. So why don't you, as one of those critics, just say, I was right, the president took my advice, and thank you very much, the invoice is in the mail?
Well, for a couple of reasons. I'm a nattering nabob of negativism. Seriously, the reasons I find it hard to take that tack are really twofold. First, I'm looking kind of down the road at the effects on Iraqi stability and unity of the way in which the U.S. has approached the problem. So, by cobbling together this awakening movement, which...
Well, we didn't cobble it together. They cobbled themselves together.
Well, they cobbled together, and we really, rode it hard and made something pretty seriously big.
But it's an indigenous phenomenon, and I mean that's one of the other criticisms of the president that I think is right is that we shouldn't credit all of this to the surge. I mean, large part of it belongs to political initiatives by the Iraqis themselves, and we're seeing among some of the Shiite populations as well. I asked the Blogging Heads folks to link to a recent talk by Colonel McMaster, who came to AEI and gave a very interesting talk about how we are seeing a kind of revulsion inside parts of the Shiite community against some of these militias. And Basra is part of that story, that where the population seemed to welcome this incursion by the central government and seems to be very glad at being rid of the militias and gangs that were running that port city.
Well, there's no doubt that the militias were tormenting people. They were a power unto themselves, and I expect that situation will resume, much to the sorrow of the people who live there. To my mind, it's, if not an intractable problem, it's not going to go away. It's not going to go away overnight. The reaction to the invading forces or the intervening Iraqi forces in and around Basra, of course, varied by neighborhood. And at the end of the day, the Sadrists still had the upper hand politically, because the fact is that the Muqtada Sadr organization, the Jaish al-Mahdi, operate a social services network in southern Iraq and in Sadr City in Baghdad that is second to none, that the state can't match. And the fact that the Mulki government hasn't been able to provide any services has left the door wide open for Sadr to use the Hezbollah and Hamas model of building up social services and making the population feel as though that as bad as the Sadr people might be, at least they provide medical care, welfare payments, food, schooling, and so forth.
When you say the door is open, that your assessment, if I'm hearing you correctly, is it is definitely true that things in Iraq are much better now than they were 18 months ago, but you are worried that this improvement is unsustainable. But you will agree that things are today better.
Well, again, it depends on where you are. Iraq is a big country. And what we've seen in terms of gains have thus far been largely reversible and,
but not yet reversed. Reversible
well,
theoretically, but not yet reversed.
Unfortunately, April was a very bad month, and in part that was due to the fighting down south. But about half of the U.S. casualties, in fact, over half of the U.S. casualties, were outside of the southern sector, where the U.S. forces were engaged in a fierce fight, in a bailout effort, really, for the Iraqi forces. So there's still a lot of fighting.
There's still a lot of fighting, but the security situation. This is what you yourself wrote. Al Qaeda, that the Sunni sheikhs of Western Iraq have rejected them. Al Qaeda people are being killed by the Sunnis themselves. Al Qaeda itself reports, in the way it communicates to the world, a sense of despair. That the government is in Basra. That does seem to be welcomed. Civilian casualties are dramatically down. There has been, very unfortunately, a spate of recent American military casualties, but for the people that the troops are there to protect, life is better. Now, you worry that this won't last, but you acknowledge that this is an improvement. And it's an improvement driven by a new strategy, a strategy that many critics of the president recommended to him a couple of years ago that he has since adopted, and it's paid off.
I think that's partly true, but like any narrative,
and
it's
now we're
not
worried
completely
about
true.
now we're worried about what comes next. And your article then says the right response to this is to revert to the strategy that didn't work, which is trying to use American pressure at the top of Iraqi politics, and then to use the threat of American withdrawal as a lever to force those kinds of concessions and compromises at the top of Iraqi politics, and to focus less on the security at the bottom of Iraqi society.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's not really correct. Let me correct a few of the nuances here. First, the surge worked in terms of lessening casualties because it piggybacked on things, as you mentioned before, on things that were already going on. The Sunnis had been badly beaten in the battle for Baghdad by the Sadrists. Actually, they couldn't defeat the entrenched power of the Jaish al-Mahdi, the Mahdi army, in Baghdad. So they were pushed back to western Iraq, and were already experiencing some pretty hard times, and were looking for ways to get out of the mess that they were in. And of course, they were pressured on the other flank by Al Qaeda. And they needed to defend themselves in that domain. So, they were already in a lot of trouble, and casualties were going down overall as a result. Now, the other thing, the horrible thing, really, is that casualties had gone down because, in the view of the people who were doing the killing, a lot of those who needed killing were done killed. And, 2 million Sunnis were pushed out of Iraq. Another million are roaming around Iraq with no place to live because they've been pushed out of their home areas, their neighborhoods, their towns. So, the violence was diminishing because
it burned the civil. But isn't that more sort of? We were very worried a year and a half ago about a civil war. We had certainly civil strife. Maybe you could even call it a civil war, but it's been contained and now stopped. And yeah, there have been population movements and terrible human suffering, I'm sure. But that has been contained, capped, and the beginnings of some kind of hopeful opportunity are now showing up. I mean, why can't we report this as a story where, we can leave to the historians the exact catalog of the mistakes that have been made along the way and how much is America's fault, how much was unavoidable, how much was just the inevitable explosion when you liberated a society that had been brutalized the way Saddam Hussein's Iraq was. But today, we seem to be working our way toward some kind of more sustainable future for Iraq in which some very important Western goals are going to be achieved. And that, maybe we paid too high a price for what we're getting, but we're certainly getting something.
Well, the point of my analysis was to show how one important dimension of U.S. policy stands to weaken Iraq's future prospects rather than strengthening them. In other words, my piece really doesn't look back terribly much. It talked about how, top-down became bottom-up and all that, but really I'm looking at the future and saying, how is the creation of this enormous Sunni army outside of the authority of the state going to affect prospects for Iraqi unity? And I'm pessimistic. Now, I think that there are things that can be done to bring this large Sunni army into the fold, but it can only be done by the Maliki government or its successor, if there are elections in the reasonably near future. I think that for that pressure to be brought to bear on Maliki, there needs to be real international involvement, and I don't think that there's going to be that kind of involvement, regrettably, unless the U.S. makes clear that it intends to withdraw. I'm not so hung up on the subject of timetables.
We're going to see five is it 5 American brigades, am I right about that, being withdrawn in July? When that happens, we're going to get, I think, a real acid test of whether or not there has been a real stabilization in Iraq. I mean, one of the things that as I look at your article, I wonder is, well, how do we test whether your propositions are right or wrong? How do we falsify or confirm them? And if it happens, for example, in July, the Americans' troops come out, the troop levels drop, and the society remains stable, or remains more stable than it's been, and the security gains do hold. If that occurs, doesn't that suggest something real and important has happened in Iraq, something positive? Now, if it goes to pieces, then right, it was all illusory. It was just held together by American power that had to be temporary. But July's the test, right? You'll be shown to be right or wrong at that point.
Well, at that point, we're still going to have 130,000 troops or more in country. So I don't think that that's a circumstance in which we'll see
But that wasn't enough in 2005 and 2006. If it turns out to be enough in 2008, that's progress.
Well, look.
And maybe opens the way to bring the number down still further, which is something I think that everybody would like to see.
Many people would like to see that. But, I never... I'll probably regret saying this. But, I never really took as gospel the notion that Iraq was going to erupt into genocidal violence. And as bad as it got in 2006, it wasn't genocidal violence. And in these sorts of civil wars, and there is a civil war going on in Iraq, violence tends to ebb and flow. The defeated parties, like the Sunnis last year, will retreat to lick their wounds, and the winners will stand down for a time to consolidate their gains, as I think the Shia certainly did, and that could change. Now,
so we'll see. If it ebbs and ebbs, that's good news.
if it ebbs and ebbs, it's good news. But I'm still very worried about the medium to long term, because the fact that you've got a very large segment of the Iraqi population not included, and that a very large percentage of that large percentage has been organized, armed, and funded by the U.S. in opposition to the state, it creates a condition for a renewal of fighting, and it prejudices outcomes against the prospect of a unified state.
Let me shift focus here slightly by raising another matter, a related matter. One of the reasons that Al-Qaeda has been seemingly so badly damaged in Iraq is because they did a lot of very foolish things, and for all of the mistakes that the United States has made, nothing seems to be quite as crazy as the terrorist group waging war on the population of the country that it claims to be trying to liberate. This weekend, Osama bin Laden released a tape, or somebody released a tape in which Osama bin Laden appears to be saying, welcoming further attacks on Arab populations and Arab governments, and seems to be positioning himself as some kind of leader of a Sunni campaign of violence against Shiites, to be justifying that. Doesn't that look like somebody who's been driven almost to some very bad political decisions by adverse outcomes for him?
You mean bin Laden per se?
Yeah. I mean, like we saw in Jordan, we've seen in Iraq that while there's a lot of sympathy for some of these Sunni extremist groups and their terrorist ideology broadly in the Arab world, when they actually then do conspicuous violence against fellow Arabs and fellow Muslims, there's a backfire, there's a recoil. And now here he is apparently calling for a huge new round of sectarian violence, Sunni Shiite violence. That doesn't look to me like, I mean, I'm no kind of expert, but that doesn't look to me like smart politics.
No, I don't think it is particularly, and the way in which some of these Al-Qaeda-affiliated groups have chosen to lash out has definitely lessened sympathy for bin Laden, and this is something we can be thankful about.
It suggests also that, I mean, what people don't make bad judgments like this in a vacuum. They do it because they're being pummeled, and they feel that they have to. That the constituency they're looking for is now the most extreme and bitter end, and desperate and.
See, I actually don't agree with that.
I was desperate. I don't mean economically desperate. I mean psychologically desperate. I mean, there are serial killers in every society, and there are some obviously in the Arab and Islamic world as well.
Yeah, I think a couple of points are in order. First, bin Laden himself has looked at this question of excessive violence and where the diminishing returns are quite carefully. And if you look at, say, his reaction to the Saudi terrorists who carried out a wave of violence in 2004 in Saudi Arabia, he was sharply critical because among other victims of these terrorists in Saudi Arabia were Muslims. And he was sharply critical indeed. So, bin Laden has always been a big tent kind of guy and wants to bring as many people into this campaign
not counting
as
Shiites,
possible.
of course.
Well,
as we just learned this,
he's been critical of killing
right,
Shiites.
but then he just reversed himself. That's the dramatic news, isn't it, of this weekend? That here's
there's. I'm sorry, continue.
Well, that it does seem to be a major reversal, of course, and it does indicate again some sense of he's desperate. I mean, and he's now looking for constituencies. I mean, if Al Qaeda is defeated in Iraq, and if what was supposed to be their great moment turns out to be their great disaster, then that can kind of unbalance a person who's probably not all that well balanced to begin with.
I guess we have somewhat different impressions of bin Laden. in some ways, I mean, one can project whatever one wants.
Well, you're,
to
on this,
you
are a genuine expert. I mean, you wrote 'The Age of Sacred Terror, co-wrote it, and you worked on this at the National Security Council in the '90s. So, tell me yours.
Well, David, my take is that he's probably not feeling too desperate. From his perspective, I think things have worked out fairly well. He's got a very strong following in Europe. He has a base and a strong following in Pakistan. He's got growing Al-Qaeda affiliated networks in Africa, particularly, where they're making some gains. In Yemen, his old stomping grounds. And he's assiduous, and Al-Qaeda is assiduous in transmitting large numbers of English language messages to a North American and British audience. I mean, the guy, like for a guy in a cave, he's been pretty active. Now, how they view the situation in Iraq is really, you raise an intriguing question, and for me, I just say the jury's out right now.
We're coming to the close of our time. I don't want to pass this by without hearing from you on what was one of the biggest international domestic stories of the week, and that was the President's speech to the Israeli Knesset on the 60th anniversary of Israel's independence. He had some harsh words to say about some unnamed people. It's unclear whether he was referring to Jimmy Carter. Some people think he was referring to his the likely Democratic nominee, and certainly Senator Obama took it as a criticism of him. You had some harsh things to say about what the president said.
Look, I think the president, first of all, was very sincere in what he said. And I'm inclined to think that the president does view proposals to talk to Hamas or Iran as appeasement. I think he does view it that way, and I think his frame of reference is tanks rolling across the border, given a free pass in a way by appeasers, wishful thinkers in the United States. I don't think that that's the reality of the situation, but I do think that's how he sees it. Now, there may have been an element of gutter politics here, a way to characterize the political opposition as cowardly appeasers, and that's certainly how Obama read it. And he may be right. It's a campaign season, and these things happen. But as far as I'm aware, those who endorse talking to Hamas or Iran endorse talking to Hamas or Iran to find out what it is they want and whether some kind of deal can be struck. But all they're talking about, as far as I can tell, is talking.
I want to say a word in defense of the president. I mean, for sure, it was aimed at a domestic political audience and to heighten the awareness of what are the stakes in the 2008 election. And right. I'll concede, I was a little surprised he would do it where he did it. I didn't think that was good form. Generally, these remarks should be made inside the country, not outside the country. So I'll concede the president's critics that point. And I'll concede also that talking to Hamas or talking to Iran is not, whether that's a good policy or bad, I would say it's bad. It's not ipso facto appeasement. You can talk to them about a lot of things. Saying, do that again and we'll hit you in the teeth is also a form of talking, and it's not appeasing. But there is, and you must know this well, inside the foreign policy community, inside that portion of the foreign policy community that has been most aligned with the Obama campaign, there is a big school of thought that says our policy toward Iran should be to find out the specific that Iran is obnoxious only because we have provoked it. They are seek a nuclear weapon to defend themselves against us. So our policy should be find out what's bothering them and take away those grievances, and then things will be fine. Assuage them, or literally appease them. And that is exactly now it's based. Now it's not an irrational strategy if you accept the premise that they have reasonable grievances. If you think their grievances are not so reasonable, then it's not such a good strategy. But the president's not wrong to characterize many of the people who advise Obama as having that view, is he not? He should have done it in America, not in Israel. But the point of what he had to say is it's correct, isn't it?
Well, look, truth in advertising, I don't actually know the people in the Obama campaign who are doing this, so I can't really speak for them or against them for that matter. But I think it is safe to say that across the board, there's a view that a nuclear-armed Iran is a very bad thing. Number one, and number two, the policies that have been pursued to deter Iran or prevent it, for that matter, from attaining a nuclear capability haven't worked. And, among the, in the quiver of policy alternatives, there is the option of reaching out to Iran and, establishing a serious dialogue with them on a range of issues that may reveal ways in which Iran can be persuaded to abandon its quest for nuclear weapons, if that's what they're doing. I personally think that that's what they are doing. Or indicate areas where Iran might be susceptible to pressure. But, there needs to be some kind of serious discussion with them. I think that's where the opposition to current policies comes from.
The president's own government is conducting talks with the Iranians, and Ryan Crocker's doing that all the time. But the issue is not talk or no talk. And I'm sure there are all kinds of back-channel conversations with Hamas. The issue is not talk or no talk. When the president deplores appeasement, what he is deploring is that there is a view, President Carter, I think, has given voice to it, and there are others and some people in the journalism world that say that these groups have essentially rational, reasonable grievances that have some claim to be met, and that can be met without tremendous, without a terrible or unacceptable price, and that's the way to have a more peaceful and stable Middle East. That's the core of the argument. It's not an argument about deal conversations through intermediaries. That's a distraction. When people say that, I think they're ignoring the president is himself. He doesn't think he's an appeaser, and yet he's having these conversations.
Well, there were people who talked about the Soviet Union way back when as having, essentially implacable objectives, and that talking to them would be pointless. Eventually the U.S. did talk to them and talk to them seriously, and it resulted in arms control arrangements and all that. I think, personally, it's too early to tell how far anyone can get with the Iranians. I think it's too late in any case for this administration to do it. There's too much bad blood and mistrust between the parties, so, probably not a great idea to try now, but perhaps in the next administration, whoever it is.
I'll state my own view. I am absolutely for the United States offering to have conversations with Iran. I'm for offering to restore diplomatic relations if the Iranians would do it, because I think it's awful that that the United States has maneuvered itself into a position where some Americans look unreasonable and people as irrational and violent and dangerous and aggressive as the Iranians can have anybody in the world thinking that they're the reasonable ones. So you should always be offering to have talks. You're willing to sit down and talk with anybody. As you say, we talked to the Soviet Unions, and they were a pretty nasty bunch. But that's a different thing from saying our strategy here is to find out what your grievances are and meet them. But the reason we're going to talk is because we're going to air mutual grievances, of which, frankly, the United States has many more reasonable ones than Iran does. And also, it's part of a propaganda campaign to expose how aggressive and implacable the Iranian regime really is. And that should be part of what your diplomatic strategy is, also to demonstrate your good faith to the world and their bad faith. And if that's all that we were hearing from people around Obama, I don't think there would be any grounds for criticizing them. But unfortunately, I don't think that's what it is. I don't think that's what the president was, and I think the president was talking about something bigger than talking or not talking.
Well, once the general campaign begins in earnest, and Obama, if he's the nominee, and I guess most people think he will be, has to go toe-to-toe with John McCain, we'll begin to see much more explicit and detailed views from the Obama campaign and from the candidate himself about what he thinks can be achieved in talking to Iran, and how those talks should be structured, and what the domestic and international objectives of these talks ought to be. But right now, we're still in the realm, unfortunately, of sloganeering.
And at that point, we all on the Republican side look forward to deploying Hillary Clinton as our surrogate to explain why he's completely wrong, or at least taking clips from her debating points. Because who said it? Who can say it better than she did?
Yeah.
All right. It was a very interesting talking to you, and
likewise, David.
And thank you. Bye bye.
Likewise. Bye.